The sun was just beginning to rise over the jagged hills of Dry Creek, painting the sky in streaks of gold and blood. The town itself was little more than a handful of buildings clinging to the edge of the desert, a place where secrets traveled faster than the wind and reputations were as fragile as glass. In the heart of it all stood the old church, its white paint peeling, bells silent, and doors wide open to the morning air. It was there, on a day that should have been filled with hope, that Clara Bell found herself standing at the altar, hands trembling, heart pounding, and eyes fixed on the stranger she was about to marry. Clara had always known her life would not be her own. Her father, Samuel Bell, was a man of hard bargains and harder debts, and when the drought came and the cattle died, he'd been left with nothing but a crumbling ranch and a daughter whose beauty was whispered about from one end of the territory to the other. She'd heard the talk, the way men looked at her, the way women pitied her. But nothing could have prepared her for the moment her father told her she was to marry a man she'd never met, a man who'd paid off the last of Samuel's debts in exchange for her hand. His name was Eli McKenna. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face carved by sun and wind, and eyes so pale they seemed to see right through her. He'd arrived in Dry Creek only a week before, riding a black horse and carrying a reputation that was as much rumor as fact. Some said he was a gunman, others a rancher from the north, but no one knew for sure. What Clara knew was that he was a stranger, and in a few short minutes, he would be her husband. The church was nearly empty. Only her father, the preacher, and a handful of townsfolk had come to witness the ceremony. Clara's mother had died years before, and her only brother was buried on the hill behind the ranch. She stood alone, her white dress borrowed and too tight at the waist, her hair pinned up with trembling fingers. She tried to steady her breathing, to remember the prayers her mother had taught her, but all she could think about was the weight of the ring in the preacher's hand and the way Eli's gaze never left her face. "Do you, Clara Bell, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" the preacher asked, his voice echoing in the empty church. Clara's lips parted, but no sound came. She looked at her father, who nodded once, his jaw clenched tight. She looked at Eli, who waited, silent and still. The world seemed to narrow to a single point, a moment that would decide everything that came after. "I do," she whispered, the words barely more than a breath. Eli's answer was just as quiet, but there was a certainty in it that made her shiver. The preacher pronounced them man and wife, and for a moment the world held its breath. Then Eli reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady, and led her out into the morning light. The town watched them go, whispers trailing in their wake. Some pitied her, others envied her, but all of them wondered what would become of Clara Bell, the girl who'd been forced to marry a stranger. Eli's ranch was a day's ride from Dry Creek, nestled in a valley where the grass still grew green and the river ran clear. The house was small but sturdy, built of stone and timber, with a porch that looked out over the fields. Clara sat stiffly in the wagon as Eli drove, her hands folded in her lap, her mind racing with questions she was too afraid to ask. He didn't speak much, only pointed out the landmarks as they passed, the old cottonwood tree, the bend in the river, the place where the wild horses came to drink. His voice was low, almost gentle, and she found herself listening for the softness beneath the roughness, the kindness that might be hiding there. When they reached the house, Eli helped her down from the wagon and carried her trunk inside. He showed her the kitchen, the bedroom, the small garden out back. Everything was neat and orderly, but there was little sign of a woman's touch. Clara wondered if he'd ever had a wife before, or if she was the first to cross his threshold. That night, as the sun set behind the hills and the sky turned to indigo, Eli built a fire in the hearth and set a pot of beans to cook. Clara sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of water, watching him move about the room. He was careful not to crowd her, careful not to touch her unless he had to. She was grateful for that, but it only made the silence between them feel heavier. After supper, Eli stood by the window, looking out at the darkening fields. "I know this isn't what you wanted," he said quietly, his back to her. "I know you didn't have a choice, but I'll do my best to be a good husband to you, Clara. I won't hurt you. I won't force you. All I ask is that you give this place a chance." Clara looked down at her hands, the words catching in her throat. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that there was more to him than the rumors and the fear. But trust was a fragile thing, and hers had been broken too many times to be given easily. "I'll try," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. Eli nodded, as if that was all he'd hoped for. He left her alone in the bedroom that night, sleeping on a cot by the fire. Clara lay awake for hours, listening to the wind in the eaves, the crackle of the fire, and the steady rhythm of Eli's breathing from the other room. She wondered what tomorrow would bring, and whether she would ever feel at home in this place, with this man who was both her husband and a stranger. The first days passed in a haze of uncertainty. Clara rose before dawn, as she always had, and set about the chores she knew by heart, fetching water, sweeping the porch, tending the small patch of vegetables behind the house. Eli was already gone most mornings, out in the fields or riding the fence line, checking for strays or signs of trouble. He left her a list of tasks, but never orders, and when he returned at midday, he always asked if she needed anything from town, or if she'd seen any sign of coyotes near the henhouse. They spoke little, their words careful and measured, as if both were afraid of saying too much. Clara watched him from the corner of her eye, trying to piece together the man behind the silence. He was gentle with the horses, patient with the dogs, and when he thought she wasn't looking, she caught him watching her with a kind of quiet longing that made her heart ache. But he never crossed the invisible line between them, never touched her except by accident, and never raised his voice, not even when the pump broke or the beans burned. At night, Clara lay awake in the big bed, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. Eli slept on the cot by the fire, his boots lined up neatly beside him, his rifle within easy reach. She wondered if he was afraid of her, or if he simply respected her fear. She wondered, too, what secrets he carried, what had brought him to Dry Creek, and why he'd chosen her, of all the women in the territory. The days grew longer, the sun hotter, and the work harder. Clara lost herself in the rhythm of the ranch, her hands growing calloused, her skin darkening beneath the relentless sky. She found a kind of peace in the routine, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since her mother died. But the loneliness lingered, a shadow that followed her from room to room, whispering doubts and fears she couldn't quite silence. One afternoon, as she was hanging laundry on the line, she heard the sound of hooves on the road. She looked up to see a group of riders approaching, dust rising behind them like a storm. Her heart leapt into her throat as she recognized the lead horseman, Sheriff Tom Grady, flanked by 2 deputies and a man she didn't know, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Eli came out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He nodded to the sheriff, his expression unreadable. "Morning, Tom. What brings you out this way?" The sheriff dismounted, his boots raising little puffs of dust. "Just checking in, Eli. Heard you brought home a bride." His eyes flicked to Clara, lingering a moment too long. "Congratulations." Clara forced a smile, her hands twisting in her apron. The stranger behind the sheriff stared at her, his gaze cold and appraising. She looked away, feeling exposed. Eli stepped closer, his presence a shield between her and the men. "Everything all right in town?" The sheriff shrugged. "Same as always. Couple of drunks at the saloon, some cattle gone missing up near the ridge. Nothing we can't handle." He paused, glancing at Clara again. "You settling in, Mrs. McKenna?" Clara nodded, her voice barely steady. "Yes, sir, thank you." The stranger spoke then, his voice low and rough. "She's a pretty one. Shame to see her out here all alone." Eli's jaw tightened. "She's not alone." The sheriff shot the stranger a warning look, then turned back to Eli. "We'll be on our way. Just wanted to say hello." He tipped his hat to Clara, then mounted up and rode off, the others following. The stranger lingered a moment, his eyes lingering on Clara, before he too turned and rode away. When they were gone, Eli turned to her, his face softening. "You all right?" Clara nodded, but her hands were shaking. "Who was that man?" Eli hesitated. "Name's Burke. He's new in town. Don't pay him any mind." But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that Burke's interest was more than casual. She watched the road long after the riders had disappeared, her heart pounding with a fear she couldn't name. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard Eli moving about the house, checking the locks, stoking the fire. She listened to the quiet scrape of his boots, the soft click of the rifle as he set it by the door. She wondered if he was afraid, too, or if he was simply used to living with danger. The days that followed were tense. Clara found herself glancing over her shoulder, jumping at every unexpected sound. Eli grew quieter, more watchful, his eyes scanning the horizon whenever he rode out. He started coming home earlier, making sure he was always nearby when she was outside. He never said why, but she knew he was worried. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the hills, Eli spoke. "I know this isn't easy for you, Clara. I know you didn't choose this life. But I want you to know, I'll protect you, no matter what." Clara looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the truth in his eyes. He was a stranger, yes, but he was also a man who kept his promises, a man who carried his own scars and secrets. She felt something shift inside her, a tiny spark of hope flickering to life. "Thank you," she said softly. Eli nodded, his gaze steady. "You don't have to thank me. It's what a husband's supposed to do." They sat in silence as the stars came out, the air cooling around them. For the first time since her wedding day, Clara felt a sense of safety, a sense that maybe, just maybe, she could find a home here after all. The next morning dawned with a restless wind, rattling the shutters and carrying the scent of rain. Clara woke before Eli, the house still and shadowed, and for a moment she simply lay there, listening to the world outside. She thought of her old life, her father's voice, the creak of the barn door, the laughter that used to fill the kitchen. It felt impossibly far away, as if it belonged to someone else. But as she rose and dressed, she realized that the ache in her chest was softer now, less like a wound and more like a memory. She found Eli already outside, mending a section of fence that had come loose in the night. He glanced up as she approached, his face breaking into a small, genuine smile. "Morning, Clara." "Morning," she replied, feeling the awkwardness between them thinning, replaced by something gentler. She offered to help, and together they worked in companionable silence, the rhythm of their movements slowly sinking. When the last post was set, Eli straightened and wiped his brow, looking at her with a kind of quiet pride. "You're a hard worker," he said. "Most folks would have given up by now." Clara shrugged, a shy smile tugging at her lips. "I never learned how." They shared a laugh, the sound surprising them both. It was the first time she'd truly laughed since coming to the ranch, and it felt like a door opening. For the rest of the day, the air between them was lighter. Eli showed her how to saddle a horse properly, how to check the water troughs, how to spot the tracks of a coyote in the dust. He was patient, never mocking, and Clara found herself wanting to learn, wanting to prove herself. That afternoon, as they sat beneath the shade of the cottonwood tree, Eli told her about his childhood in the north, about the winters so cold the river froze solid, about his mother's singing, about the brother he'd lost to fever. Clara listened, her heart aching for the boy he'd been, for the losses that had shaped him. She shared her own stories, too. Her mother's garden, her brother's wild pranks, the way her father used to dance with her in the kitchen when he thought no one was watching. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of rose and violet, Clara realized she was no longer afraid of Eli. He was still a stranger in many ways, but he was also kind and lonely and trying as hard as she was to make this new life work. She wondered if, given time, they might find something like happiness together. But peace in Dry Creek was always fragile, and that night, as the wind howled and the rain began to fall, trouble came knocking. It started with a pounding at the door, loud enough to rattle the dishes on the shelf. Eli was up in an instant, rifle in hand, his body tense and alert. Clara stood behind him, her heart hammering in her chest. "Who's there?" Eli called, his voice steady. "It's Burke," came the reply, muffled by the storm. "Open up, McKenna. We need to talk." Eli hesitated, then opened the door a crack. Burke stood on the porch, rain streaming from his hat and coat, his eyes hard and wild. Behind him, two other men waited, their faces shadowed. "What do you want?" Eli asked, not lowering the rifle. Burke spat into the mud. "Heard you've been hiding something, McKenna. Or should I say someone? Folks in town are talking. They say you're not who you claim to be." Eli's jaw tightened. "I don't care what folks say. You got business here. You say it, and go." Burke's gaze slid to Clara, who stood just behind Eli, her face pale but resolute. "Pretty wife you got there? Shame if something happened to her." Eli stepped forward, blocking Burke's view. "You're not welcome here, Burke. Take your men and leave." Burke smiled, slow and mean. "We'll be back, McKenna, and next time we won't be asking." He turned and strode into the rain, his men following. Eli shut the door and bolted it, his hands shaking with anger. Clara moved to his side, her fear replaced by a fierce determination. "What do they want, Eli?" He looked at her, his eyes haunted. "They want trouble, and they're not going to stop until they get it." For the first time, Clara saw the weight Eli carried, the burden of being an outsider, of having to fight for every scrap of peace. She reached for his hand, her fingers threading through his. "We'll face it together," she said, her voice steady. Eli squeezed her hand, his grip warm and strong. "Together," he echoed. The next days were tense. Eli kept his rifle close, and Clara learned to shoot, her hands steady even as her heart raced. They worked side by side, never straying far from the house, always watching the horizon for signs of trouble. The townsfolk grew colder, their greetings curt, their eyes suspicious. Clara heard the whispers, about her, about Eli, about the marriage that had shocked the whole town. But in the quiet moments, when the work was done and the world was still, Clara and Eli found comfort in each other. They talked late into the night, sharing hopes and fears, dreams and regrets. The walls between them crumbled, replaced by trust and something deeper, a tenderness that grew with each passing day. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Eli turned to her, his expression earnest. "I know I'm not the man you would have chosen, Clara, but I want to be the man you need. I want to give you a life worth living." Clara looked at him, her heart full. "You already have, Eli. You gave me a home when I had none. You gave me kindness when I expected nothing. Maybe that's all I ever needed." He reached for her then, his touch gentle, his eyes searching hers for permission. She nodded, and he drew her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. In that moment, the past and the pain faded away, leaving only the promise of something new. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the little house, Clara and Eli found peace, in each other and in the life they were building, one day at a time.